Morning, family. What a wonderful time of worship. Thank you, worship team. It was awesome. By the way, I don't know if you noticed there in the beginning of the service when some of the people here in the front were dancing around. I've always said that the day you see me doing that will be the day you know revival has come. Without a doubt, to Lone Hill Church. When we think of some of the giants of the faith, and I'm talking particularly about the Old Testament, the heroes of the faith, those that are mentioned, for example, in Hebrews 11, that chapter that we call the Hall of Faith. I think some of the people that we would just straight away think of are people like Abraham, the man of faith, the father of the faith, or Moses, the great leader of the Israelites, the man through whom God gave the law. You don't get much greater than Moses, or King David, the greatest king Israel ever had, a man after God's own heart, or the prophets like Elijah and Isaiah. These are some of the heroes of the faith that we think about. Yet there was a man who walked this earth 2,000 years ago, a contemporary of Jesus Christ, who Jesus himself, God the flesh, referred to as the greatest person that had ever lived up to that time. You know who that man was? John the Baptist. In Matthew chapter 11, verse 11, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. That's a pretty remarkable statement. Imagine Jesus said that about you. Well, you don't need to imagine, because he does. He says in verse 11, chapter 11, verse 11, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven, that's you, and you, and you, and you, is greater than he, is greater than John, and by implication, all who came before him. Why did Jesus say this about John the Baptist? And why does he say it about us as New Testament believers? Well, let's turn to Matthew 11 to find out. Matthew 11. We'll be focusing on the first 11 verses this morning, but we're going to divide it into three sections or three pictures that Jesus gives us of John the Baptist. And the first is a picture of a doubting or discouraged Baptist. And when I say Baptist, I don't mean someone from the local Baptist church. I mean John the Baptist. This is found in verses 1 to 6, picture of a doubting Baptist. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, that's John the Baptist, heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. So let's stop there for now. Okay, so John the Baptist has landed himself a prison sentence. He's spoken out against King Herod. He's basically publicly rebuked him for having an affair with his brother's wife, and for that, he's landed himself a prison sentence. And while in prison, John hears about what's going on in the ministry of Jesus, all the wonderful things that Jesus is doing. And he begins to have doubts about his identity. He begins to question if Jesus really is the Messiah. So much so in verses 2 and 3 that he sends some of his own disciples. He obviously has access to his disciples while he's in prison. He sends some of his own disciples to Jesus. Jesus is preaching to a crowd somewhere in Galilee. He sends them to Jesus with a question. Are you the one who was to come? Are you really the Messiah? Or should we expect someone else? Now, why the doubts? After all, think about everything that has transpired prior to Matthew 11. Matthew chapter 3, John the Baptist has testified about Jesus. He said about him, I'm not even worthy to untie his sandals. I'm not even fit to carry this man's sandals. That's how highly John the Baptist thinks of Jesus. That's how great he thinks he is. Again, in chapter 3 of Matthew, Jesus has come to John to be baptized by John. And what has John said? You come to me to be baptized? I need to be baptized by you. He recognizes that Jesus is far superior to him. he recognizes, he identifies him as the Messiah. And then in chapter 5, Jesus goes on to preach the greatest sermon that's ever been heard, the Sermon on the Mount, teachings that have never been heard before, the Beatitudes, the Golden Rule, love one another, do unto others as you would have them do to you. More than that, he's healing thousands of people. The blind eyes are being opened, the deaf ears are being opened, the dead are being raised, the lepers are being cured, the demon-possessed are being set free. What more do you want? Is that not what messiahs are supposed to do? So why the doubts? Why the question? Well, to answer that, we must remember the expectation of the Jewish people at that time. See, on the one hand, they expected messianic blessing. That when the Messiah came, he would do all the wonderful things that Jesus was doing. But on the other hand, they expected messianic judgment, which Jesus was not fulfilling. They expected that this messianic figure would come and he would bring judgment on the enemies of God, vengeance on the enemies of God, on the enemies of Israel. That he would come and conquer through military might, that the nation of Israel would be set free from its bondage to Rome, that Israel would be the head and not the tail. I mean, again, go back to chapter 3 of Matthew. John the Baptist has said of Jesus that his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, gathering the wheat into the barn, and burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire, the fire of God, the judgment of God. That's what John the Baptist was expecting. And so you can understand with this strong expectation in mind why John the Baptist, as he languishes in prison, as time goes by and still there's no judgment that Jesus is bringing, why the doubts begin to creep in. Things are not quite turning out the way he had expected them to be. I shouldn't be sitting in prison, he thinks. So as I already said, he sends disciples to Jesus with this question: are you really the one who was to come? Or should we expect someone else? Now, Jesus doesn't directly answer the question. What he does in verses 4 and 5 is he sums up his ministry to that point in time by referring to two Old Testament prophecies, both from the book of Isaiah, both of what talk about what the Messiah would accomplish when he comes, both of which talk about this twin theme of messianic blessing and messianic judgment. And I'm going to read you these two prophecies from Isaiah. They're very short. I'm going to read to them in the entirety. And then afterwards, we'll hear the parts of the prophecy that Jesus quotes. Are you with me? I'm going to read the prophecies from Isaiah. Afterwards, we'll hear the parts of the prophecy that Jesus quotes in his response to this question. Isaiah 35, 4-6. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear, your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. What's that talking about? Messianic judgment. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute shout for joy. There's messianic blessing. And then Isaiah 61, verses 1-2. A prophecy we know so well. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. There's messianic blessing. But the very next part of the sentence, and the day of vengeance of our God. There's the messianic judgment. So those are the prophecies. Now listen to the parts of the prophecy that Jesus quotes in his response to John's question. In verses 4 and 5, Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. What's the glaring difference between Jesus' response and the prophecies? What does he leave out? The parts about messianic judgment. He only quotes the parts about messianic blessing. And it's as though Jesus is saying something like this to John. John, I know what you're expecting. I know you're expecting messianic blessing, which I'm fulfilling perfectly. All the wonderful things that are happening. But you're also expecting messianic judgment, which is not happening. But John, now is not the time for judgment. Oh, that awaits a future time. But now is the time for blessing. Now is the time for healing. Now is the time for life. Now is the time for blessing. This is the era of grace, John, that we are living in. Don't fall away on account of me. Don't allow your expectations of what you think I'm going to do to blind you to who I am. Trust in God's plans and purposes for the world and for your life. And so that's the picture of a doubting Baptist. But secondly, we have a picture of a defended Baptist. Look at verses 7 to 11a. Picture of a defended Baptist. As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. What did you go out into the desert to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes on king's palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. And then the verse, the main verse for today. I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Okay, so picture the scene. John's disciples are now going back to John to report to John the Baptist the response that Jesus has given to his question. And maybe there's a little bit of murmuring in the crowd, a little bit of whispering going on in the crowd. They're saying something like this, this John the Baptist, we thought that he was a mighty man of God, but a little bit of opposition comes his way, a little bit of persecution, and he's falling away. He's beginning to doubt the identity of Jesus. He's a little bit of a wimp, this John the Baptist. So Jesus uses this as an opportunity to defend John by asking a series of questions, rhetorical questions. He says to the crowd, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? Talking about John. Did you go out to see a reed swayed by the wind? In other words, someone with no backbone, someone who just falls over easily, as it were, at the slightest breeze. A wimp, as it were? No, he was a mighty man of God who preached repentance and righteousness. That's not what you went out to see. Well, then what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? Not to hear a prosperity preacher dressed in his suit? No. This was a poor man. He wore a leather belt around his waist and camel's hair, and he ate locusts for food. No, that's not what you went out to see. Okay, well then what did you go out to see, Jesus says? A prophet? Yes, says Jesus. And more than a prophet. More than a prophet? In what way? Are not prophets pretty much the pinnacle? Men who speak the very words of God? In what way was John the Baptist more than a prophet? Well, Jesus tells us. Because not only was John a prophet, but he himself was the subject of a certain prophecy. No one ever prophesied about Moses or Isaiah or Elijah, but John the Baptist was actually prophesied about in Scripture. Where? In the very last book of the Bible, in Malachi. Malachi chapter 3, approximately 400 years before Jesus came, before the Messiah came, the prophet Malachi said these words. Jesus quotes it for us in verse 10. He says, this is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. In other words, the prophet Malachi predicted that before the coming of the Messiah, there would be this forerunner, this Elijah-type figure, this messenger, this herald who would announce the arrival of the Messiah, who would go before him, who would introduce him to the people of his day. And that person was none other than John the Baptist. And it's in the context of that prophecy, the Malachi prophecy about John being this man who would prepare the way for Jesus, who would announce his arrival, who would point people to him, that he goes on to say, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Do you hear what Jesus is saying? Do you hear what made John the Baptist so great in his eyes? What gave him such significance? Is that it fell to this one man in salvation history to prepare the way for his arrival, to announce his arrival, to introduce the people of his day to the Messiah. You see, what made John the Baptist so great in the eyes of Jesus was not, for example, the length of his ministry. A person like Isaiah had a ministry of 40 years. John the Baptist's ministry lasted 6 months. It was not, for example, that he was a better leader than anyone who had come before him, a better leader than Moses. You don't get a much better leader than Moses, who led 2 million people in the wilderness for 40 years. It wasn't that he was a better leader. It wasn't that he performed greater miracles than anyone who'd ever come before him. In fact, in the Gospel of John, it tells us John the Baptist never performed one miracle. It wasn't that he was a more godly man, a man of greater character, although I'm sure he was a man of noble character. But ultimately, he was a sinner saved by grace. It wasn't anything of those things. What made him so great was that it fell to this man to introduce Jesus to the people of his time. The long-awaited Messiah, to say, that's him. He was able to point to Jesus with greater clarity and understanding and simplicity and immediacy than anyone else who had ever come before him. You see, there is a sense in which the prophets pointed to the Messiah, to Jesus. Think of Isaiah, for example, the prophecies we have and throughout the book, even Isaiah 53, that talk about his death and resurrection. But it was veiled. It was talking about events 700 years into the future. But it fell to this one man to finally say, there he is. That's the one we've been waiting for thousands of years as the Jewish people. And that's what made him so great in the eyes of Jesus. Which, by the way, tells us a lot about who Jesus himself believed himself to be. Let me explain what I mean. If you'd never met me before this morning, if I was coming to preach for the very first time this morning, I lived in a foreign country perhaps, and I arrived, and just before I got up to preach, Jones got up to introduce me to all of you. He said, I just want to tell you a little bit about Jonathan Andrew, where he comes from, the job he has, and so on and so forth. I then get up, and the very first thing I say is, I tell you the truth. Among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than Jones Lawiwe, which we all think is true, Jones, because he had the immeasurable privilege of introducing me to all of you. You would think that I'm absolutely crazy. You wouldn't be far off there, but because who am I? I'm no one special. I'm not different to anybody here this morning. But Jesus knew who he was. He knew that he was God in the flesh, and that this man John had been given the privilege of introducing him to the world, to the people of his time. And that's what made him so great. So that's the picture of a defended Baptist. But then thirdly and finally, we come to a picture of an eclipsed or surpassed Baptist. See, going back to verse 11, the second half of verse 11, we'll read the whole verse. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. That's a staggering statement. Let that sink in. Feel its weight. Do you count yourself least in the kingdom of heaven? Are you a Christian? Even the lowliest of the saints among us? Well, if you do, then Jesus Christ calls you greater than John the Baptist, and by implication, all who'd ever come before him. Now, of course, we must ask the question, why? We must interpret this verse in context, because you know the old saying, a text without a context becomes a pretext for a proof text. You can make the Bible say just about anything you want it to say. What's going on in verse 11 is that Jesus is making two comparisons. He's saying, look, if John the Baptist was greater than all who'd ever come before him, not because there was anything special about John and his character or his ministry or that he was a better leader or anything like that, but simply due to the fact that he lived in this unique period of salvation history where he could point people to the Messiah, he could introduce them to him in ways that no one else before him was able to, then it follows that in the second half of the verse, he's saying that we as New Testament believers are greater than John, not because there's anything special about us, not because we're morally superior or anything like that, have greater ministries, but because we are able to point people to Jesus Christ. We're able to introduce people to the Messiah in ways that are clearer and with greater accuracy and understanding than even a man like John the Baptist could. You see, it's a salvation historical issue. It's not that there's anything inherently great about us that makes us superior. It's simply the fact that as New Testament believers, we live in this unique period of salvation history. As the commentator Ridderbos put it, in the dispensation of promise, John the Baptist, his significance was unsurpassed. Nevertheless, it was nothing compared to the message brought by the least of Jesus' disciples and followers in the dispensation of fulfillment. You see, as much as John the Baptist could point to Jesus and say, there he is in the flesh, could he tell the people of his day about his death and resurrection and ascension and the fact that he's coming back again one day and the pouring out of the Spirit, the new birth? No, he didn't even live to see these things. But we can. Truths that so often we take for granted, yet are the most profound truths in the universe, truths that the ancients long to see fulfilled, truths that angels marvel at. You see, you may not be a biblical scholar. You may not be able to articulate the doctrine of justification very well. You may not know about the three views of the millennium. You know the three views of the millennium in Revelation 21? Premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial. I hold to a fourth view, panmillennial. I just think it's all going to pan out in the end. You may not know about these different views. You might not know, have a great understanding of all that theology, but you know enough to say to a lost person, I don't have this all figured out yet, but I know that Jesus Christ died for my sin and your sin, that he somehow took my place on that cross, and then he rose to life 3 days later. He's alive, and he rules and reigns, and he's coming back again one day, and he sent the Spirit, and I'm alive inside. I've been born again, and I have a relationship with the living God, and you too can have that relationship if you will repent of your sin and trust in the only one who can save you. Those so-called simple truths of the gospel about Jesus, about his cross work, is far more than a man like John the Baptist knew. And the fact that we can introduce the people of our day to Jesus like this, that we can point to him with such clarity and accuracy and simplicity as New Testament believers, makes us great in the eyes of Jesus, according to Matthew 11:11. So if that's the case, then why are so many of us here this morning, including myself, silent? Why are we silent? The very thing that, according to Jesus, gives us significance, knowing him and making him known to the people of our day, we don't fulfill. We don't take advantage of the fact that we live in this unique period of salvation history where we can introduce people to Jesus the way that we can. We don't fulfill the Great Commission that he's given us. The last time I preached here at Lonel, this young guy came up to me. He was a recent convert to Christianity, and he was telling me about how he was sharing the gospel at work, but he was a little bit discouraged because people were asking him questions that he didn't have the answers to. And I said, listen, that will all come in time. You'll grow in your knowledge, and in any case, you'll never have all the answers. You just keep on telling people about Jesus. You just keep on telling people about the gospel. And I thought to myself afterwards, I used to be like that. So convicted by some of the passion that has gone out to tell others about Christ, to introduce people to him. And so as we close this morning, let me leave you with two questions. Firstly, what gives you a sense of purpose, of significance? Is the house you live in, the car you drive, the amount of money in your bank account? Youth, beauty, whatever it may be, there's anything wrong with those things? Or is it what makes you significant in the eyes of God? Knowing him and making him known to the people of this world. And secondly, as we approach this wonderful time of Christmas, as we celebrate this time, who are you going to introduce to Jesus Christ? Amen.